Sarah's hands were already bleeding by the third day, but she didn't stop. The morning mist clung to the Tennessee mountains like a shroud, and she could feel the weight of complete silence pressing down on her shoulders. Every muscle in her body screamed in protest as she dragged another stone from the creek bed, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the hollow ache in her chest that had driven her here. 6 months ago, she had been Dr. Sarah Mitchell, respected veterinarian with a thriving practice in Nashville. 6 months ago, she had been planning a wedding to David, the man she thought would be her forever. 6 months ago, she had believed in love, in partnership, in the idea that two people could build a life together. Now she was just Sarah, alone on 40 acres of inherited mountain land that her grandmother had left her, determined to build something with her own two hands since everything else had crumbled to dust. The betrayal had been swift and brutal. Finding David with her best friend Rebecca in their shared apartment had shattered something fundamental inside her. Not just her heart, but her faith in human connection itself. The way they had looked at her when she walked in, not with guilt or shame, but with pity. As if she had been the problem all along. As if her dedication to her work, her animals, her patients, had somehow justified their deception. She had sold everything. The practice, the apartment, the furniture they had chosen together. Kept only her veterinary supplies, her grandmother's old pickup truck, and a fierce determination to disappear from the world that had wounded her so deeply. The 40 acres in the Smoky Mountains had been sitting empty since her grandmother's passing 2 years ago. Sarah had visited once for the funeral, but hadn't really seen it then. Now, standing in the overgrown clearing where her grandmother's old cabin had once stood before a fire claimed it, she saw possibility in the raw wilderness. The decision to build with stone had been practical at first. The mountain was full of it, scattered along the creek and jutting from the earth like ancient bones. But as the days turned into weeks, she began to understand that she was building more than just shelter. Every stone she lifted, every careful placement, was an act of defiance against the chaos that had torn her life apart. The work was backbreaking. She had watched countless YouTube videos on stone construction, had ordered books on traditional building techniques, but theory and practice were vastly different things. Her first attempts at laying a foundation had been disasters. Stones that looked perfectly fitted would shift and settle overnight, sending entire sections tumbling down. She would stand in the morning light, looking at the rubble of her previous day's work, and have to fight the urge to simply walk away from it all. But walking away was what the old Sarah would have done. The new Sarah, the one forged in betrayal and loss, picked up each fallen stone and began again. The nearest neighbor was 15 miles down the mountain. The closest store was 25 miles of winding mountain roads. She had deliberately chosen isolation, craving the silence after months of well-meaning friends and family trying to fix what couldn't be repaired with casseroles and advice. Here, the only sounds were the creek rushing over rocks, the wind through the pines, and the satisfying crack of stone against stone as she worked. Her grandmother's old well still functioned, providing clear mountain water that tasted of mineral earth. She had set up a camping area under a canvas tarp stretched between trees, with a small propane stove and a cooler she kept stocked with basic supplies during her weekly trips to town. The simplicity was liberating after years of complicated schedules and endless responsibilities. But the loneliness was crushing. She hadn't anticipated how the silence would amplify her thoughts, how the endless repetition of lifting and placing stones would give her mind too much space to wander. During the day, she could lose herself in the physical demands of construction. Her world would narrow to the immediate, the weight of the stone in her hands, the angle of placement, the level of each course. But at night, lying on her sleeping bag under the vast expanse of stars, the silence became a living thing that whispered all her failures back to her. The local wildlife had gradually accepted her presence. A family of deer would drink from the creek each morning at dawn, watching her with cautious curiosity. A red-tailed hawk had claimed a perch in the old oak tree that shaded her work area, occasionally crying out as if offering commentary on her progress. She found herself talking to them, her voice rusty from disuse, telling them about her day's struggles and small victories. 3 weeks into the project, a summer storm hit with the sudden violence that mountain weather was known for. She had watched the clouds building all afternoon, dark and ominous against the peaks, but had been too focused on completing a particularly challenging corner to take proper shelter. When the rain finally came, it came in sheets that soaked her to the skin within seconds. She stood in the downpour watching water cascade through the gaps in her carefully laid stone walls. and felt something break inside her that had nothing to do with the construction. The tears came then, hot and angry, mixing with the cold rain as she screamed at the sky, at David, at Rebecca, at the unfairness of a world that could take everything she had built and scatter it like leaves in the wind. When the storm passed, she found herself sitting in the mud beside her damaged foundation, surrounded by stones that had shifted in the saturated earth. The rational thing would have been to wait for everything to dry, to assess the damage properly before beginning repairs. Instead, she began lifting the displaced stones immediately, her movements mechanical and desperate. It was then that she first sensed she was being watched. The feeling started as a prickle between her shoulder blades, a subtle awareness that penetrated even her grief-fueled focus. She paused, a heavy limestone block balanced in her arms, and slowly turned toward the tree line. The forest was thick with summer growth, shadows layered upon shadows, but something about the stillness felt deliberate rather than empty. She called out, her voice cracking from emotion and disuse. "Hello, is someone there?" The only answer was the drip of rainwater from pine needles and the distant call of her hawk friend. But the feeling persisted, a presence just beyond the edge of perception. Over the following days, the sensation of being observed became a constant companion. Not threatening, exactly, but undeniably there. Sometimes she would catch a glimpse of movement in her peripheral vision, a shift in the shadows that suggested human form rather than animal. But whenever she turned to look directly, there was nothing but forest. She began talking aloud more frequently, partly to combat the oppressive silence and partly because she had the strange notion that someone was listening. She would explain her building techniques to the trees, describe the ache in her muscles to the stones, voice her doubts and fears to the creek that carried them away downstream. The work itself was becoming meditation. Her hands had developed thick calluses, her back had grown stronger, and she was learning to read stone the way her grandmother had once read the weather. Each piece of limestone and sandstone had its own character, its own ideal placement in the growing walls. Some stones were natural cornerstones, strong and angular. Others were meant to fill gaps, their irregular shapes perfect for maintaining level courses. Her progress was measured in inches rather than feet, but it was steady. The foundation was complete and solid, anchored deep into bedrock that had been exposed when she cleared away decades of forest debris. The first course of stones was level and true, an achievement that had taken her 2 weeks of constant adjustment and relaying. Now she was working on the second course, learning how to select and shape stones that would bond properly with those below. The physical transformation was dramatic. She had always been active, but veterinary work was more about precision and endurance than raw strength. Now her shoulders broadened with muscle, her hands became tools as hard and capable as any she owned. She could lift stones that would have required 2 people when she started, could work for hours without the crushing fatigue that had marked her first weeks. But it was the mental transformation that surprised her most. The constant noise in her head, the endless replay of conversations with David, the what-ifs and should-haves that had tormented her in Nashville, gradually quieted. The stone demanded presence, demanded that she exist fully in each moment of lifting and placing and adjusting. There was no room for regret when a 100-pound block of limestone needed to be positioned with millimeter precision. The summer heat intensified as July progressed. She had developed a routine that worked with the mountain's rhythm, up before dawn to work in the cool morning air, resting during the brutal midday heat under her tarp with a book or her sketches, then returning to construction as the shadows lengthened toward evening. Her skin had bronzed and toughened, her hair had grown long and wild, held back by whatever strips of fabric she could find. She was becoming something new up here, something that bore little resemblance to the polished professional who had fled Nashville in tears and rage. This new version of herself was harder, more self-contained, shaped by solitude and physical labor into something she didn't yet fully recognize but was beginning to respect. The cabin's design had evolved organically as she worked. What had started as a simple rectangular plan had grown more complex as the natural contours of the land and the available materials suggested modifications. A natural depression near the foundation became the logical place for a root cellar. An outcropping of bedrock shaped the orientation of what would be the main room. She was learning to work with the mountain rather than imposing her will upon it. Still, the watching presence remained. If anything, it had become more noticeable as the days passed. Sometimes she would find small signs that someone had been near her camp. A stack of firewood that she didn't remember gathering, her water containers mysteriously refilled, tools left in slightly different positions than she remembered. Nothing threatening or intrusive, but clear evidence that her solitude was not as complete as it appeared. She began leaving small offerings, feeling slightly foolish but following an instinct she couldn't name. A portion of her evening meal left on a flat stone at the edge of the clearing. A thermos of coffee placed by the trail that led deeper into the forest. They were always gone by morning, though whether taken by human or animal hands, she couldn't say. The isolation that had once felt like punishment was becoming sanctuary. She woke each morning with purpose, fell asleep each night with the satisfaction of progress made. The stones were teaching her patience in a way that nothing in her previous life had managed. Some days, she would spend hours on a single stone, shaping it with hammer and chisel until it fit perfectly into the growing wall. Other days, she would discover a piece that seemed designed by nature for its exact position, sliding into place with satisfying finality. As the walls rose, her confidence grew. The second course had been easier than the first, the third easier still. She was developing an intuitive understanding of how stones wanted to be arranged, how weight and pressure distributed through the structure. Her grandmother's voice seemed to whisper guidance sometimes, remembering stories of the original cabin that had stood here, built by her great-grandfather with similar patience and similar stones. But with the growing confidence came growing awareness of how much work remained. The walls were only 3 feet high, with at least 5 more feet to go before she could begin thinking about roof beams and weatherproofing. At her current pace, the structure wouldn't be enclosed before winter, and winter in these mountains could be brutal. The thought of spending months in her canvas shelter as snow piled around an unfinished cabin was daunting. But the alternative, returning to the civilized world before her sanctuary was complete, was unthinkable. She would make it work somehow. She had to. The watching presence had become almost comforting in its consistency. Whoever was out there seemed content to observe without interfering, to respect the boundaries of her work while maintaining their own distance. She had stopped trying to catch sight of them directly, accepting their presence as she had accepted the hawk's daily commentary and the deer's morning visits. One evening, as she cleaned her tools in the creek's shallow water, she spoke directly to the forest for the first time. "I know you're there," she said quietly, not looking up from the stone dust she was scrubbing from her hammer. "I don't know who you are or why you're watching, but I want you to know that I'm not afraid. I'm just trying to build something here, something that will last." The forest absorbed her words in silence, but the quality of that silence felt different somehow. More receptive, more present. As if her acknowledgement had shifted something in the delicate balance of their unspoken relationship. That night, as she lay in her sleeping bag looking up at stars that blazed with an intensity impossible in the city, Sarah felt a peace that she hadn't experienced since childhood. The mountains held her small drama with infinite patience, neither judging nor comforting, simply providing space for her transformation to unfold. Tomorrow she would lift more stones, would continue the slow process of building walls that would shelter this new version of herself. She was no longer running from her old life. She was building towards something entirely new. The morning Sarah found the perfectly shaped cornerstone waiting beside her foundation was the morning everything changed. She had been struggling for 3 days with a particularly challenging corner where 2 walls met at an odd angle, dictated by the natural slope of the land. Nothing in her pile of gathered stones seemed right, and she had begun to consider adjusting her entire design to accommodate what materials she had. But there it was, sitting exactly where it needed to be, a piece of sandstone that might have been carved specifically for that corner, with angles that matched her walls perfectly and a flat face that would provide an ideal surface for the course above. She stood staring at it for a long moment, her coffee growing cold in her hands, trying to process how such a perfect stone could have simply appeared overnight. Her first instinct was to look toward the tree line where she always sensed the watching presence. This felt like more than coincidence, more than the helpful, mysteriously refilled water containers she had grown accustomed to. This was direct intervention in her work, a crossing of the invisible boundary that had existed between observer and observed. She approached the stone cautiously, as if it might disappear if she moved too quickly. It was real enough, solid sandstone with the kind of weathered surface that spoke of decades lying in the creek bed. But its placement was too precise to be natural, positioned exactly where she had been measuring and remeasuring the gap that needed to be filled. "Thank you," she said aloud, her voice carrying clearly in the still morning air. The words felt inadequate for what had been given, but they were all she had. She lifted the stone, surprised by its perfect weight, neither too heavy nor too light for comfortable handling, and carried it to the corner where it belonged. The fit was flawless. The stone settled into place with a kind of solid finality that spoke of permanent belonging. As she worked through the morning, building the course around that perfect cornerstone, Sarah found herself glancing frequently toward the forest. The presence felt stronger today, more focused, as if her acknowledgement had given permission for closer observation. Over the following weeks, the gifts continued. Never obvious, never overwhelming, but always exactly what she needed when she needed it most. A set of metal shims that allowed her to level stones more precisely, appearing near her tool collection after a particularly frustrating day of trying to make irregular pieces fit. A length of rope, weathered but strong, that materialized when she was struggling to move larger blocks from the creek to her work site. More significantly, she began finding stones that seemed pre-selected for specific purposes. Not just any usable pieces, but stones that fit her emerging wall like puzzle pieces designed by nature itself. A long, flat piece that spanned perfectly between two vertical supports. A keystone that locked an arch she was attempting over what would become a window opening. Each discovery felt like a small miracle, but also like a conversation she was beginning to understand. The work progressed faster with these mysterious contributions. What had been a solitary struggle against the mountain's raw materials became something more collaborative. She would leave areas partially completed in the evening, and often wake to find that the ideal stones for continuation were waiting nearby, not obviously placed, but present in ways that felt like suggestions rather than gifts. Her unknown helper remained invisible during daylight hours, but she began to sense patterns in their presence. The strongest feeling of being watched came during her afternoon rest periods, when she would retreat to the shade with water and whatever simple meal she had prepared. It was then, when she was still and quiet, that the presence felt most attentive. She started talking during these times, sharing her thoughts about the construction, describing her plans for the interior layout, explaining why she had chosen this isolated place to rebuild her life. At first, the words felt strange, spoken to empty air, but gradually they became as natural as thinking aloud. The forest was a good listener, absorbing her stories without judgment or advice. "I was a veterinarian," she told the trees one afternoon in late July, her hands wrapped around a cup of creek-cooled water. "I loved it, you know. There's something about healing, about being able to fix what's broken, that made me feel useful in the world. But I realize now that I was so focused on fixing everyone else that I never learned to take care of myself." The admission hung in the humid air like morning mist. She had never spoken those words aloud before, had barely allowed herself to think them. But something about the mountain's vast patience made it safe to examine truths that would have been too painful in the civilized world. "David used to say I loved animals more than people," she continued, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. "Maybe he was right. Animals are honest about their needs. They don't pretend to want one thing while secretly wanting something else. When a dog is hurt, it doesn't lie about the pain. When a cat doesn't trust you, it doesn't put on a performance until you're vulnerable enough to damage." A slight breeze stirred the leaves overhead, and for a moment, Sarah could swear she heard something like understanding in the sound. Not agreement or disagreement, just acknowledgement that her pain had been witnessed and accepted. The walls of her cabin reached shoulder height by August, and with that milestone came a shift in both her confidence and her relationship with her unseen helper. The structure was beginning to look like actual architecture rather than an ambitious pile of stones. She could walk inside the perimeter and envision rooms, could see how windows would frame views of the creek and the distant peaks. More importantly, she was beginning to trust her instincts about stone placement in ways that felt almost mystical. Her hands had developed a sensitivity that allowed her to feel the potential stress points in a wall, to know instinctively which stones would bear weight properly and which would create weaknesses. The work was becoming intuitive in a way that her veterinary practice had never been, despite years of training and experience. It was during this period of growing confidence that she made her first real mistake. A section of the east wall that had seemed solid began to show signs of settling, tiny gaps appearing between stones that had been perfectly fitted just days before. The problem was in the foundation, she realized with a sick feeling. One of the base stones hadn't been properly seated on bedrock, and the weight of the courses above was causing it to shift. The repair would require dismantling nearly 20 feet of carefully constructed wall, removing the problematic foundation stone, and rebuilding everything from the ground up. It was the kind of setback that would have broken her spirit during those first desperate weeks, but now she approached it with grim determination. She had learned too much to be defeated by a single mistake, no matter how costly. She began the demolition the next morning, carefully removing each stone and setting it aside for reuse. The work was heartbreaking in its own way, undoing hours of careful labor, but she tried to see it as learning rather than loss. Each stone she removed taught her something about weight distribution and structural integrity that would make her next attempt stronger. It was while she was working alone in the heat of the afternoon, sweat-soaked and discouraged despite her philosophical attitude, that she heard the first word. "Careful." The voice was quiet, barely more than a whisper, but distinctly human and distinctly male. Sarah froze with a 40-pound block of limestone in her arms, her heart hammering as she slowly turned toward the source of the sound. At the edge of the clearing, partially concealed by the dappled shadows of a massive oak, stood a man. He was tall and lean, with long dark hair held back by a leather cord and skin that spoke of a lifetime spent outdoors. His clothes were practical mountain wear, faded jeans and a cotton shirt that had seen many washings. But it was his face that caught her attention. Strong features with the kind of weathered dignity that came from living close to the land, and dark eyes that held both intelligence and something deeper, something that might have been ancient wisdom. They looked at each other across the clearing for a long moment that stretched like held breath. Sarah's first instinct was fear, the natural wariness of a woman alone in a remote place confronted by an unexpected stranger. But as the silence extended, she realized that fear was fading, replaced by something closer to curiosity. This was her watcher, she knew with absolute certainty. The presence she had felt for weeks had finally taken visible form. "You're right," she said finally, settling the stone more carefully in her grip. "I was rushing. This one needs to go back further in the pile." He nodded slightly, a gesture that suggested both approval and encouragement to continue. Sarah placed the stone with deliberate care, then straightened to face him properly. "You've been helping," she said. It wasn't a question. "Some," he acknowledged. His voice carried an accent she couldn't quite place, something that suggested English might not be his first language, though he spoke it clearly enough. "Why?" He was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his words were measured and thoughtful. "My grandmother built a cabin on this mountain. Took her 2 years, working alone after my grandfather died in the war. I watched her struggle with stones that were too heavy, with walls that wouldn't stay true. Swore if I ever saw someone else trying to do the same impossible thing, I'd lend a hand where I could." Sarah felt something tight in her chest begin to loosen. This wasn't a threat or an intrusion, but a connection to the mountain's history, a link to others who had chosen this hard path of building shelter with their own hands. "What happened to her cabin?" she asked. "Still standing, up the ridge about 3 miles. I live there now." He gestured vaguely toward the higher elevations where the forest grew thick and untouched. "Been watching this clearing since the old cabin burned, wondered if anyone would ever try to build here again." The revelation reframed everything. Her isolation hadn't been as complete as she'd imagined, but somehow that made it feel safer rather than violated. She had been building under the protection of someone who understood the magnitude of her task, who had witnessed the same struggle in someone he loved. "I'm Sarah," she offered. "Thomas," he replied, "Thomas Crow Feather." The name settled between them like a bridge. Sarah found herself smiling for the first time in days, despite the setback with her wall and the intimidating amount of work that lay ahead. "Would you like some coffee?" she asked. "I was about to take a break anyway." Thomas considered this for a moment, then stepped fully into the clearing. "Coffee sounds good." As Sarah busied herself with her camping stove and supplies, she was acutely aware of Thomas moving around the construction site. He didn't touch anything, but she could feel him assessing her work with an expert's eye. When she glanced over, he was crouched beside the foundation section she had been dismantling, running his fingers along the bedrock with the focused attention of someone who knew stone. "Foundation's good here," he said without looking up. "Problems with that piece of shale you used for shimming. Shale compresses under weight. Should have used limestone or sandstone for the base course." Sarah felt a flush of embarrassment. She had been so proud of finding what seemed like perfectly fitted pieces that she hadn't considered how different types of stone would behave under stress. It was exactly the kind of mistake that experience would prevent, but experience was what she was here to gain. I have limestone pieces that would work better, she said, stirring instant coffee into 2 cups of hot water. I just didn't realize it mattered. Everything matters with stone work, Thomas said, accepting the cup she offered. Stone remembers every stress, every shift, every mistake, but it forgives too if you're willing to learn from what it teaches you. They drank their coffee in companionable silence, and Sarah found herself studying this man who had been her invisible guardian for so many weeks. There was something about his stillness that spoke of deep patience, the kind of calm that came from living in harmony with natural rhythms rather than fighting against them. "How long have you been building?" he asked, nodding toward her walls. 2 months, almost 3. The time seemed both longer and shorter than that as she said it. It's taking much longer than I expected. Good stone work can't be hurried, Thomas said. My grandmother always said that a wall built right will stand for 100 years, but a wall built fast might not last the winter. The wisdom in those words resonated deeply with Sarah's growing understanding of her project. She wasn't just building shelter. She was creating something that would outlast her, that would stand as testament to this transformation she was undergoing in the mountains. I've never done anything like this before, she admitted. I was a veterinarian. This is all completely new to me. Thomas looked at her with something that might have been respect. Takes courage to start over completely. Easier to stay with what you know, even if it's not serving you anymore. The insight was gentle but penetrating, and Sarah realized that this stranger understood her motivations better than most of the friends she had left behind in Nashville. There was no judgment in his observation, just recognition of a choice that few people would make. Would you, she began, then stopped, uncertain how to phrase the request that was forming in her mind. Would you be willing to show me how to fix this properly? I can pay you for your time. Thomas shook his head slowly. Don't need payment, but I'd be honored to help you learn what the stone wants to teach. The phrase struck her as beautiful and exactly right. This wasn't about imposing her will on raw materials, but about learning to work in partnership with them. It was a philosophy that seemed to extend beyond construction into every aspect of how Thomas moved through the world. When can we start? Sarah asked, surprised by her own eagerness. After months of fierce independence, the thought of collaboration felt like a gift rather than a compromise. Now if you want, Thomas said, setting down his empty coffee cup. Afternoon light's good for seeing how stones fit together, and this wall's not going to fix itself. Sarah laughed, a sound that seemed to surprise them both with its genuine joy. Let's do it. As they moved toward the damaged section together, Sarah felt something shift in her understanding of what she was building here. The cabin would still be hers, still represent her journey from heartbreak to wholeness, but it would also be something more. It would be a bridge between her old life and new possibilities, between isolation and connection, between the person she had been and whoever she was becoming. The work continued, but now it carried the rhythm of shared purpose rather than solitary struggle. And for the first time since arriving in the mountains, Sarah felt like she was exactly where she belonged. Working with Thomas transformed everything Sarah thought she knew about building. Where she had been fighting against the stone, trying to force pieces into predetermined patterns, he taught her to listen to what the materials themselves were saying. It was like learning a new language, one spoken in weight and balance, in the way limestone sang against sandstone when properly fitted. This one's telling you it wants to be a capstone, Thomas said on their third afternoon working together, running his weathered hands along a piece of granite that Sarah had dismissed as too irregular. See how it's got that natural crown? It's meant to sit on top, to shed water and hold everything below it in place. Sarah looked at the stone again, trying to see what Thomas saw. Gradually, the seemingly random bulges and angles began to make sense. The crown he mentioned would indeed direct water away from the wall, and the broader base would distribute weight evenly across the course below. What she had seen as flaws were actually features, designed by millions of years of geological pressure for exactly this purpose. How do you see that so quickly? She asked, genuinely curious. I've been staring at stones for months, and I still feel like I'm guessing most of the time. Thomas smiled, an expression that transformed his serious features into something almost boyish. My grandfather was a stonemason, not by trade, but by necessity. Cherokee families, we built everything ourselves back then. Had to. He started teaching me to read stone when I was maybe 5 years old. Said it was like reading tracks or weather signs. Once you know what to look for, the stone tells you everything you need to know. The mention of his heritage clicked something into place for Sarah. She had been wondering about his name, about the patient way he moved through the forest as if he belonged there as completely as the trees themselves. There was a connection to this land that went deeper than simple residency, something that spoke of generations of intimate knowledge. "Is this traditionally Cherokee territory?" she asked, then immediately worried she was prying too deeply. This whole mountain range was Cherokee land for centuries before the government decided otherwise, Thomas said matter-of-factly. My family managed to avoid the removal in 1838, hid up in these mountains until it was safe to come out. Been here ever since. Your grandmother's family, they were some of the few white settlers who showed respect for what was here before them. Sarah felt a wave of gratitude for ancestors she had never known, people who had apparently earned their place on this mountain through character rather than simply taking it by force. It made her own presence here feel less like escape and more like inheritance, a responsibility to live up to standards set by previous generations. Thomas had a way of teaching that never made her feel foolish for what she didn't know. Instead of pointing out her mistakes directly, he would suggest alternatives, guiding her toward better solutions while allowing her to maintain ownership of her decisions. It was a rare gift, that kind of patient instruction, and Sarah found herself learning faster than she ever had in formal educational settings. "Stonework is meditation," he told her one morning as they sorted through her growing pile of materials, separating pieces by type and potential use. "Can't rush it, can't force it. Have to be present for every placement, every decision. Stone knows when you're not paying attention, and it'll make you pay for the distraction later." The truth of that observation became clear as Sarah's technique improved. When she was fully focused, feeling the weight and texture of each piece, considering how it would interact with its neighbors, the work flowed with surprising ease. But whenever her mind wandered, when she tried to hurry or when she got caught up in planning 3 steps ahead, mistakes happened. Stones would sit wrong, courses would go out of level, and she would have to stop and rebuild. "It's teaching me to be present," she realized aloud one afternoon. They had been working in comfortable silence for hours, the only sounds the creek's constant murmur and the satisfying click of properly fitted stone. "I haven't thought about Nashville, about any of that mess, for 3 hours straight." Thomas nodded as if this was exactly what he had expected to hear. Mountain time moves different than city time. Up here you can't live in the past or the future. Stone won't let you. It demands that you exist right now, in this moment, with this exact piece you're holding. The insight felt profound in a way that Sarah hadn't anticipated when she first fled to the mountains. She had come here to hide from her problems, but the work was teaching her something more valuable than escape. It was teaching her how to inhabit her own life fully, how to be present for her own experience in a way she never had been before. As the walls rose higher, approaching chest level, the complexity of the work increased. Corner stones required more precise fitting, window and door openings needed careful planning, and the weight of each course meant that mistakes became more costly to correct. But with Thomas's guidance, Sarah found herself capable of challenges that would have overwhelmed her just weeks earlier. "You're thinking like stone now?" Thomas observed one morning as Sarah carefully selected a piece for a particularly difficult gap. She had rejected 3 options before finding one that felt right, even though to his eyes all of them would have worked adequately. "Trust your instincts. They're getting educated." The phrase, "thinking like stone," stuck with Sarah throughout the day. There was something about the permanence and patience required by the work that was reshaping her approach to everything else. Problems that once would have sent her into anxious spirals now seemed to call for the same methodical consideration she gave to wall construction. Step by step, piece by piece, building solutions that would last. Their conversations during breaks ranged far beyond construction techniques. Thomas was an unexpected source of mountain wisdom, sharing knowledge about everything from weather patterns to medicinal plants that grew wild in the forest. He showed her which berries were safe to eat, how to read animal tracks in the creek mud, which trees would provide the best firewood when winter came. "This mountain's got everything you need if you know how to see it," he said one evening as they watched sunset paint the distant peaks in shades of amber and rose. "But it's not going to just give it to you. You have to earn the knowledge, prove you're worthy of the trust." Sarah was beginning to understand what he meant. The mountain had tested her resolve through months of solitary struggle, had demanded that she commit fully to her choice before revealing its secrets. Thomas's emergence from the shadows felt like a reward for persistence. a sign that she had passed some invisible threshold of belonging. The physical demands of the work were changing her in ways that went beyond simple conditioning. Her hands had developed a sensitivity that allowed her to detect the smallest irregularities in stone surfaces. Her eyes could assess the structural soundness of a wall section at a glance. Her body had learned to move with the efficient grace of someone who worked with their hands for survival rather than recreation. But perhaps most significantly, her relationship with time had fundamentally shifted. In her previous life, every moment had been scheduled, every activity measured against productivity metrics. Here, time moved according to natural rhythms: the arc of the sun, the changing quality of light, the stone's readiness to accept or reject a particular placement. Some days she might spend 6 hours on a single course. Other days, everything would fall into place with magical efficiency. "You can't hurry stone," Thomas had told her during their first day working together. "But you can learn to work at the speed stone wants to teach you." The wisdom of that approach extended beyond construction. Sarah found herself eating when she was hungry rather than according to rigid meal schedules, sleeping when exhaustion overcame her rather than forcing herself to maintain conventional bedtimes. The mountain was teaching her to listen to her own needs in ways she had forgotten were possible. Their collaboration also revealed the depth of planning required for a structure that would survive mountain winters. Thomas helped her think through problems she hadn't even considered: how to prevent frost from undermining the foundation, where to place drainage that would direct spring runoff away from the walls, how to orient windows to capture maximum solar warmth while avoiding the worst of winter storms. "Building up here, you're not just fighting gravity," Thomas explained as they worked on a complex corner joint that would anchor the entire north wall. "You're building against ice and wind and rain that'll find any weakness you leave behind. Stone's forgiving of honest mistakes, but it'll punish careless work without mercy." The standards were intimidating, but Sarah found herself rising to meet them. Every stone placement became a small act of integrity, a decision to build well rather than quickly, to create something that would honor both the materials and the mountain that provided them. As summer progressed toward autumn, the walls reached waist level, then shoulder level, then finally stood high enough that Sarah could no longer reach the top course from ground level. Thomas had anticipated this milestone and arrived one morning with a wooden ladder constructed from mountain oak and lashed together with strips of leather. "Can't buy that kind of ladder in town," he said simply, as if crafting furniture from forest materials was the most natural thing in the world. "But oak cut from this mountain knows how to behave up here. Hardware store ladder might not." The gift represented more than simple practicality. Like everything Thomas did, it demonstrated a philosophy of using what the land provided, of working in harmony with natural systems rather than imposing foreign solutions. Sarah ran her hands along the smooth wooden rungs, feeling the care that had gone into their shaping, the attention to detail that ensured both function and beauty. "Thomas," she said, struggling to find words adequate to her gratitude, "I don't know how to thank you for all this. The ladder, the teaching, the time you've spent helping me learn. I came up here to do this alone, but I'm realizing that maybe the best things can't be done entirely alone." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes focused on the distant peaks where morning mist was beginning to lift. When he spoke, his words carried the weight of carefully considered truth. "My grandmother used to say that the strongest walls are built by many hands, even if only one person holds the stones. You've been building alone, but not in isolation. The mountain's been teaching you, your grandmother's spirit's been guiding you, and I've been honored to add what little help I could." The perspective reframed everything Sarah had understood about her journey. She hadn't been as alone as she'd imagined, but rather surrounded by a community that included the living and the dead, the human and the more than human, all working together to help her create something meaningful. As they positioned the ladder against her walls and she climbed to place her first stones at the new height, Sarah felt like she was ascending into a different understanding of what home could mean. Not just shelter from the world's storms, but a place that connected her to generations of builders, to the land that supported them all, to the patient wisdom that came from learning to work in partnership with forces larger than herself. The cabin was becoming more than refuge, it was becoming belonging. The first serious snow came earlier than expected, dusting the highest peaks in mid-September, while Sarah and Thomas were struggling to complete the walls before winter made outdoor work impossible. They had been racing against time for weeks, working longer hours as the days shortened, and the mountain air took on the sharp edge that warned of harder weather ahead. Sarah had grown to love their working rhythm. Thomas would arrive each morning just after sunrise, appearing from the forest with the quiet suddenness she had learned to expect. They would assess the previous day's work together, planning the day's tasks while sharing coffee heated over her camping stove. Then they would work in companionable silence, broken only by brief consultations about stone selection or structural decisions. The walls now stood 7 feet high, nearly ready for the massive log beams that would support the roof. Sarah had located the trees she wanted to use, standing dead oaks killed by disease but still structurally sound, and Thomas had agreed to help her harvest and place them. It was work that absolutely required 2 people, and Sarah had begun to accept that her vision of complete independence had evolved into something more collaborative. "Weather's changing," Thomas observed that September morning, studying cloud formations that meant nothing to Sarah's untrained eye. "We've got maybe 3 weeks of good building weather left, then it'll be too cold for stone work until spring." The timeline was tight, but manageable if everything went according to plan. They needed to complete the walls, set the roof beams, and create at least basic weather protection before the serious cold arrived. Sarah had already ordered materials for a temporary roof that would protect the interior while she worked on permanent solutions during the winter months. But the mountain, as always, had its own agenda. The storm system moved in 2 days later with a violence that caught even Thomas off guard. Sarah woke to wind that howled through the trees like something alive and angry, bending the massive pines until their tops nearly touched the ground. The temperature had dropped 30 degrees overnight, and sleet was beginning to mix with rain that fell in sheets across the clearing. "We need to get to higher ground," Thomas said, appearing at her camp with an urgency she had never seen from him before. He was carrying a pack loaded with supplies and wearing the kind of heavy weather gear that spoke of serious preparation. "This is going to be bad, and your camp's right in the path of the runoff when the creek rises." Sarah looked toward the creek, which had indeed swollen to twice its normal size and was running brown with mountain soil. The gentle stream that had provided such peaceful background music to her work was becoming something dangerous, and she could see debris beginning to pile up against the natural dams created by fallen logs. "What about the cabin?" she asked, though even as the words left her mouth she knew they were foolish. The walls were strong, but without a roof they offered no protection from a storm like this, and her camp with its canvas shelter and propane stove was completely inadequate for serious weather. "Cabin will be fine," Thomas said firmly. "Stone doesn't care about storms, but we need to get you somewhere safe until this passes." He led her up through the forest, following what seemed like no path at all but which gradually revealed itself to be a deer trail that wound steadily upward. The wind was stronger among the trees, but also more diffuse, broken by trunks and branches into gusts rather than the sustained battering they had experienced in the clearing. Sarah's pack was heavy with the essential supplies she had grabbed from her camp, and the steep climb combined with the storm's chaos left her breathing hard within the first mile. But Thomas maintained a steady pace that somehow managed to be both urgent and sustainable, pausing occasionally to help her over obstacles or to check that she was managing the conditions. "How far?" she called over the wind during one of these brief stops. "Another mile," Thomas replied, rain dripping from the brim of his hat. "My grandmother's cabin, it's built for weather like this." The trail continued upward through increasingly wild terrain. Sarah began to understand why Thomas seemed to materialize and disappear so effortlessly around her building site. He moved through this landscape like water flowing downhill, following lines of least resistance that were invisible to her, but perfectly obvious to someone who had spent a lifetime learning the mountain's secrets. The cabin, when it finally appeared through the trees, was like something from a fairy tale. Built entirely of stone and massive timber, it seemed to grow directly from the mountainside itself. The walls were thick enough that the windows looked like tunnel openings, and the roof was covered with slate that had weathered to the same gray-green as the surrounding rocks. But it was clearly a working home rather than a museum piece. Smoke rose from a stone chimney, windows glowed with warm lamplight, and a covered porch held the accumulated tools and supplies of someone who lived by the work of their hands. "It's beautiful," Sarah breathed and meant it. The cabin possessed the kind of organic rightness that came from being built by people who understood both their materials and their environment. It looked like it had been there forever, like it belonged to the mountain as completely as the trees that surrounded it. Thomas led her up onto the porch, where Sarah gratefully set down her heavy pack and took her first full breath since the climb had begun. From this vantage point, she could see across the valley to where her own building site was barely visible through the storm. Even at this distance, she could see that the creek had risen dramatically, flooding areas that had been dry land when they left. "Thank you," she said, suddenly overwhelmed by the realization of how much danger she had been in without even knowing it. "I would have tried to ride it out down there, wouldn't I? I would have convinced myself the canvas was adequate and stayed until it was too late to leave safely." Thomas nodded matter-of-factly. "Mountain storms can be killers if you're not prepared for them properly. Better to retreat early than to fight them from a weak position." He pushed open the heavy wooden door, and Sarah stepped into a warmth that seemed to wrap around her like an embrace. The interior was a single large room with sleeping area partitioned off by a curtain of woven wool. A wood stove provided both heat and cooking surface, and oil lamps cast dancing shadows on walls lined with books, tools, and what appeared to be several generations' worth of accumulated possessions. But it was the sense of peace within the space that struck Sarah most powerfully. Despite the storm raging outside, despite walls that were thick enough to muffle the worst of the wind, the cabin felt like a sanctuary in ways that went beyond simple physical protection. This was a place where people had lived and loved and raised children, where knowledge had been passed down and wisdom accumulated like sediment in still water. "Your grandmother built this?" Sarah asked, running her hands along a windowsill that had been worn smooth by decades of use. "Her and my grandfather, with help from the community that was here then. Took them 3 years, working mostly in the summers when farming allowed time for building." Thomas moved around the space with the casual efficiency of someone thoroughly at home, lighting additional lamps and stirring something in a pot that hung over the fire. "It must have been amazing growing up here." "Had its challenges," Thomas said with a slight smile. "Closest neighbor was 10 miles down the mountain, no electricity until I was a teenager, had to snowshoe to school more winters than not. But it taught me things I couldn't have learned anywhere else." Sarah settled into a chair by the fire, grateful for the warmth that was beginning to penetrate her rain-soaked clothes. Through the windows, she could see the storm intensifying, but here in the solid comfort of Thomas's home, the weather seemed like a distant concern. "What happened to the community your grandparents were part of?" she asked. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, stirring the contents of the pot with a wooden spoon that looked handmade. "Some families got bought out when the government started acquiring land for the national park. Others just couldn't make it work anymore, especially after the kids started leaving for jobs in the cities. By the time I was grown, it was mostly just my grandparents and 2 other families scattered across the mountain." There was sadness in his voice, but also acceptance of changes that were larger than any individual could control. Sarah began to understand that Thomas's decision to stay, to maintain his family's connection to this place, represented a kind of stubborn faith that had its own heroism. "Do you ever get lonely?" she asked, then immediately worried the question was too personal. Thomas considered this seriously before answering. "Sometimes, but loneliness and solitude are different things. Loneliness is wanting connection you can't find. Solitude is choosing to be alone because that's where you find peace. Most of the time, what I have here is solitude." The distinction resonated with Sarah's own experience over the past months. She had come to the mountain running from loneliness, from the pain of broken connections and betrayed trust. But gradually, the isolation had transformed into something chosen rather than imposed, something that felt like healing rather than hiding. The storm continued through the afternoon and into the evening, but within the stone walls of Thomas's cabin, time took on a different quality. They cooked a simple meal together over the wood fire, and afterward Thomas produced a bottle of whiskey that he claimed had been aged in a barrel hidden somewhere on the mountain. "To mountain storms," he said, raising his glass in a toast that seemed to encompass both the danger and the shelter that weather could provide. "To unexpected sanctuary," Sarah replied, and meant more than just the cabin. As the evening wore on, they talked in ways they never had during their working hours. Thomas told stories of his grandparents, of the old ways of living that had sustained Cherokee families in these mountains for generations. Sarah found herself sharing memories of her grandmother too, the woman who had left her this mountain land, and who had perhaps known exactly what inheritance she was providing. "She used to tell me that land chooses its people as much as people choose land," Sarah said, watching flames dance in the stone fireplace. "I thought it was just romantic nonsense when I was younger, but now I'm starting to think she might have been right." "Cherokee families, we've always believed that," Thomas agreed. "Land's not something you own, it's something you belong to. Your grandmother understood that, even though she wasn't native herself. That's probably why she was able to make a life here that worked with the mountain instead of against it." The insight felt like a key turning in a lock Sarah hadn't even known existed. Her decision to build on this specific piece of mountain land hadn't been arbitrary flight from heartbreak. It had been a response to something deeper, a calling that connected her to both the place and the people who had cared for it before her. Late that night, as the storm finally began to exhaust itself against the mountains, Sarah lay in the sleeping area Thomas had prepared for her with blankets that smelled of mountain herbs and wood smoke. Through the small window beside the bed, she could see stars beginning to appear between racing clouds. Tomorrow they would return to her building site to assess whatever damage the storm had caused. There would be cleanup, possibly repairs, certainly delays in their race to complete the walls before winter. But for the first time since beginning this impossible project, Sarah felt no anxiety about the setbacks that lay ahead. The mountain had tested her again, as it had tested Thomas's grandparents and her own grandmother before them. And like them, she had found shelter not just from the storm, but in the connections that the storm had revealed. She was not building alone after all, had never been building alone, despite her fierce insistence on independence. The cabin that waited in the clearing below was her project, her sanctuary, her proof that she could create something beautiful from the broken pieces of her former life. But it was also part of a larger story, a continuation of the conversation between human hands and mountain stone that had been going on in this place for generations. And for the first time since David's betrayal had shattered her world, Sarah felt like she was part of something larger than her own pain, something that would outlast any individual heartbreak or triumph. The storm had stripped away her illusions of solitary struggle, but it had given her something far more valuable in return. The knowledge that she truly belonged here, not as an exile from civilization, but as the latest in a line of people who had chosen to make their home in partnership with the mountain's wild grace. The damage from the storm was less severe than Sarah had feared. Her stone walls stood exactly as they had left them, unmoved by wind that had toppled trees elsewhere in the forest. But her camping area was completely destroyed, her canvas shelter torn to shreds, and her supplies scattered across the clearing by flood waters that had receded, leaving behind a thick layer of creek mud and debris. "Stone remembers what it's taught," Thomas observed, running his hands along the walls they had worked so hard to build properly. "Metal and canvas, they're not from here. They fight the mountain instead of working with it." Standing in the aftermath, Sarah felt a profound shift in her understanding of what she was creating. The cabin wasn't just shelter from weather. It was a partnership with forces larger than herself, built from materials that belonged to this place and would return to it eventually, but slowly, over centuries rather than seasons. They spent the next 3 days cleaning up and salvaging what they could from Sarah's scattered possessions. Most of her camping equipment was a total loss, but her tools had survived, protected by their own weight and the solid construction that made them valuable in the first place. More importantly, her veterinary supplies were safe, secured in waterproof containers that had kept their contents dry even during the worst of the flooding. "You'll stay at the cabin until we can get your walls finished and a roof on," Thomas said matter-of-factly as they surveyed the cleanup. It wasn't really a question, but Sarah appreciated that he phrased it as if she had a choice. "I can't impose on you like that," she protested, though the thought of spending nights in the warm security of the stone cabin was powerfully appealing. "Not imposing. Mountain's too dangerous for camping this time of year, and we've got work to finish before the serious cold hits." Thomas looked at her with the patient expression she had learned meant he wasn't going to argue about practical matters. "Besides, easier to get an early start if we're both in the same place." So Sarah moved her surviving possessions up the mountain to Thomas's home, and for the first time in months found herself living with another human being. The adjustment was easier than she had expected, partly because the cabin was large enough to provide privacy when needed, but mostly because Thomas was such an unobtrusive presence. He moved through the shared space with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything else, never crowding her or making her feel like a guest rather than a temporary resident. They established routines quickly. Thomas would wake first and start the fire, Sarah would prepare coffee and breakfast, and they would spend the early morning hours planning their work while the mountain came alive around them. The relationship between them had shifted during the storm, though neither of them had acknowledged it directly. They moved around each other with an awareness that went beyond simple politeness, a careful attention that suggested possibilities neither was quite ready to explore. Sarah caught Thomas watching her sometimes with an expression she couldn't quite interpret, and she knew he must see similar uncertainty in her own glances. But the work provided safe ground for their growing connection. With winter approaching rapidly, they threw themselves into the final push to complete the walls and set the roof beams. The urgency created a rhythm that left little energy for emotional complications, though Sarah was increasingly aware of how naturally they worked together, how their different strengths complemented each other. "This corner needs a different approach," Thomas said one morning, studying a section where the walls met at an angle that had been giving them trouble for days. "Want to try something my grandfather taught me? It's not standard construction, but it works better with stone that doesn't want to cooperate." Sarah had learned to trust Thomas's innovations completely. His grandfather's techniques, passed down through generations of mountain builders, often solved problems that modern methods couldn't handle. They had incorporated several such solutions into her cabin. A foundation drainage system that used layers of gravel and clay to redirect water away from the structure. A wall design that included deliberate gaps for thermal expansion, corner reinforcements that locked the entire structure together like a three-dimensional puzzle. The technique Thomas suggested for the troublesome corner involved cutting slots in the larger stones to accept wooden keys that would hold everything in alignment while allowing for the natural movement of the structure. It was more labor-intensive than simply mortaring the joints, but it would create a connection that would actually strengthen over time as the wood aged and tightened. "Your grandfather sounds like he was an engineer," Sarah said as they worked on cutting the precise slots the technique required. "Never had formal education past 4th grade," Thomas replied, "but he understood how things wanted to fit together. Said engineering school taught people to fight against natural forces, but mountain building taught you to work with them instead." The philosophy had become central to Sarah's understanding of what she was creating. Every decision, from the orientation of the building to the selection of individual stones, was made in conversation with the mountain's own preferences. The result was a structure that felt inevitable rather than imposed, as if it had always belonged in this specific spot. As October progressed and the walls finally reached their full height, the time came to set the roof beams. This was the work that truly required two people, and Sarah felt a flutter of anxiety about whether she and Thomas could manage the massive timbers safely. Each beam weighed several hundred pounds and had to be lifted 20 feet into the air, then positioned with enough precision to support the weight of the entire roof structure. "We'll do it the old way," Thomas said when Sarah voiced her concerns. "Block and tackle, patience, and respect for gravity." He had constructed a system of ropes and pulleys anchored to trees around the building site, creating mechanical advantage that would allow them to lift weights far beyond what human muscle could manage alone. It was simple technology, but perfectly suited to their needs and their isolation from modern equipment. The first beam went up smoothly, a massive oak trunk that had been shaped with traditional tools into a perfect support timber. Sarah operated the pulley system while Thomas guided the timber into position, and when it finally settled into the notches they had cut for it, the sound of wood against stone rang across the clearing like a bell. "One down, 7 to go," Thomas said with satisfaction, but Sarah could see the relief in his expression. If the system worked for the first beam, it would work for all of them. By the end of the week, all 8 roof beams were in place, creating the skeleton that would support whatever roofing material Sarah eventually decided to use. Standing inside the structure for the first time with a real roof overhead, even if it was only the bare bones of one, Sarah felt an overwhelming sense of accomplishment. "It's really going to be a house," she said, running her hands along the walls that had grown from impossible dream to solid reality over the past 5 months. "Already is a house," Thomas corrected gently. "Just needs a little more protection from the weather." That night, they celebrated with another bottle of Thomas's hidden whiskey and a meal cooked over the fire that seemed to taste better than anything Sarah could remember eating in her previous life. The conversation ranged from technical details about winter construction to broader questions about what Sarah planned to do once the cabin was completed. "Will you go back to veterinary work?" Thomas asked as they watched flames dance in the fireplace. "I don't know," Sarah answered honestly. "I love healing animals, but I'm not sure I want to go back to the kind of practice I had before. Maybe something different. Maybe something that doesn't require quite so much separation from places like this." She had been thinking about that question for weeks as the cabin neared completion. The person who would live in the finished structure was not the same person who had fled Nashville in heartbreak and rage. The mountain had changed her in fundamental ways, and she wasn't sure her old life would fit the new version of herself. "There's always need for someone with your skills up here," Thomas said carefully. "Not many vets willing to make house calls to places like this mountain. Animals get sick and injured here just like everywhere else, but getting them to town for treatment isn't always possible." The suggestion opened possibilities that Sarah hadn't considered. She could maintain her profession while building a life that honored what she had learned about herself during these months of solitude and construction. It wouldn't be easy, establishing a rural practice that could sustain her financially while providing the kind of life she now knew she wanted, but it seemed more possible than returning to the world she had left behind. "I'd need to finish the cabin first," she said, "and probably build some kind of clinic space, something set up for treating larger animals." "Plenty of room on your land for expansion," Thomas pointed out, "and plenty of people around here who know how to build with stone." The conversation continued late into the night, exploring practical questions about establishing a rural veterinary practice, but also touching on deeper issues about what kind of life Sarah wanted to create for herself. For the first time since her world had collapsed, she found herself making plans that extended beyond simple survival, thinking about a future that felt like moving toward something rather than running away. The weeks that followed brought the first serious cold of the season, temperatures that dropped below freezing and stayed there for days at a time. Sarah was grateful for the warmth and shelter of Thomas's cabin, but also eager to complete her own structure enough to move into it before winter made further construction impossible. They worked with increasing urgency to install temporary roofing that would protect the interior from snow and rain. It wasn't the final roof Sarah wanted, but it would be weatherproof enough to allow her to work on interior finishing during the coldest months. They covered the beams with plywood and tar paper, created basic gutters to direct water away from the foundation, and sealed the gaps around windows and doors with whatever materials they could find. The day Sarah moved into her unfinished cabin was gray and cold, with snow flurries that suggested winter was about to arrive in earnest. But as she stood inside the stone walls she had built with her own hands, surrounded by the simple furniture Thomas had helped her construct from mountain oak, she felt a sense of homecoming that had nothing to do with completion and everything to do with belonging. "It's beautiful," Thomas said, looking around the space that was still rough and unfinished, but already possessed the qualities that would define it. Solid construction, honest materials, and a quality of light that came from windows positioned to capture the mountain's changing moods. "Thank you," Sarah said, meaning more than just his compliment on her work. "For everything. For watching over me when I didn't know I needed watching. For teaching me how to build properly. For sharing your home when the storm hit. I couldn't have done this without your help." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, studying the flames in the small wood stove they had installed as temporary heat. When he finally spoke, his words carried a weight that suggested careful consideration. "My grandmother used to say that the mountain brings people what they need when they're ready to receive it. I think maybe we needed each other for different reasons at exactly the right time." The observation hung between them like a bridge that either of them could choose to cross or not. Sarah felt her heart rate increase, awareness of how much their relationship had deepened over the months of working together, of how natural it felt to share space and purpose with this man who had become far more than a helpful neighbor. "Thomas," she began, then stopped, uncertain how to voice what she was feeling without risking the friendship that had become so important to her. "I know," he said simply. "I feel it too, but you're just getting settled here, just figuring out who you want to be in this new life. No need to complicate that with anything else right now." His wisdom was gentle but clear, and Sarah felt a wave of gratitude for his patience. She wasn't ready yet, was still too newly emerged from the wreckage of her previous relationship to trust her own emotions completely. But the possibility was there, acknowledged and accepted, waiting for whatever time might be right. That night, Sarah slept in her own cabin for the first time, wrapped in sleeping bags on a simple bed frame Thomas had built from oak boards. The stone walls held warmth from the wood stove, and through her windows she could see stars that blazed with the clarity that only came with mountain air and distance from city lights. The structure around her was still incomplete, still needed months of finishing work before it would be truly done. But it was home in ways that went beyond physical shelter. It was proof that she could rebuild her life from the foundation up, that she could create something beautiful and lasting from her own determination and the materials the mountain provided. Outside, snow began to fall in earnest, the first significant accumulation of what promised to be a long mountain winter. But inside her stone walls, surrounded by the work of her own hands and the knowledge that she had found her place in the world, Sarah felt only warmth and the deep satisfaction that came from having built something that would last. The cabin was finished enough, and she was home,